Hi, I'm David Miller, and this is the first of 7 mini lectures on Shakespeare's play, A Midsummer Night's Dream. On the left there, you see the titles of all 7 lectures. Now, since our focus in this course is on families, we'll approach Shakespeare's play by looking briefly at the history of English families in the 16th century to see how contemporary pressures and debates leave their marks on the action, characters, and language of the play. This should provide a solid introduction both to Midsummer Night's Dream and to the major themes that run throughout the works we'll be reading this semester. Before we get started, though, let's be clear that when we talk about English families in this period, we're talking about religion, social rank, and property. Shakespeare's characters are typically drawn from the upper ranks of the aristocracy, where the form and dynamics of family life were very different than they were among the poor. When Shakespeare does show us working men like the mechanicals in this play, we don't see them as members of families. When he shows us servants, they belong not to families of their own, but to the great households where they live and work. So, for the record, there's a strong class bias to the forms of family organization that we'll be working out. They apply to the propertied classes only. Okay, now what you see in the column on the left is an outline of the topics for this mini-lecture. All the mini-lectures will follow this format, with the topic or topics covered in the current slide shown in a contrasting font on the left. This way you'll always be able to tell where you are. We will start with the effects of the Protestant Reformation begun in England under Henry VIII. The Reformation altered the official state religion in England, but its effects extended far beyond the church. Protestant reformers launched a series of culture wars aimed at refashioning ideals of family life, transforming education, and ultimately changing the form of government. The forces that gained momentum in the early 16th century led 100 or so years later to civil war and the execution of King Charles I. With Shakespeare, we're not there yet. A Midsummer Night's Dream dates from the mid-1590s, near the end of the long reign of Elizabeth I. The Queen is aging, and her popularity is fading, and a combination of bad weather and crop failures are taking their toll on the morale of the Commonwealth. As you'll see, these immediate circumstances do turn up in the play, but before we zoom in on them, let's back up to look at some more long-range social changes that were underway. We can start by asking how the Protestant Reformation fostered changes in family life among the propertied classes. Social historians have credited the Reformation with consolidating the authority of the father within the family. For example, fathers took over some of the responsibilities that had belonged to the priesthood of the church, leading members of the household in prayer and serving as the spiritual head of the family. The authority of husbands over wives was increasing as a part of this change. From the late Middle Ages through the 17th century in England, the typical form and structure of the family was gradually shifting away from extended kinship networks and toward a more concentrated cluster, what we now call the nuclear family. This shift weakened the relative position of the wife within the family. As part of an extended kinship network, she had her own kin and allies, but as the extended network weakened and the nucleus drew together, she lost that source of power. When the Protestant Reformation redefined the husband and father as the spiritual head of the household, it took the subordination of women within the family one step further. About the only group of women who weren't seriously affected by these changes would be aristocratic widows, who were able to maintain both high social standing and the authority that comes with it, along with financial independence and personal independence once they had outlived their husbands. This doesn't mean that the status of women was uncontroversial, just the opposite. Remember, I said these are culture wars. The rights and responsibilities of women were a subject of controversy and debate then as now, and there was a wide range of opinion. But the Protestant reformers, such radicals in many respects, were generally quite conservative on this score. Another change during this period concerned laws of inheritance. Changes in these laws gave the father more control over how his estate would be disposed. This increased the father's control even over adult children. At the same time as the structure of the propertied family was changing, so too was the political organization of England. The Protestant Reformation coincides with the highest point of absolute monarchy, and this means that the king's power was consolidated on a national level just as the father's power was within the household. On both levels, the dominant trend was toward more centralized power, vested in a single figure, the father or the king. These changes mirrored each other, for the monarchy increased its power at the expense of those same kinship networks that were giving way to the nuclear family. The political powers of aristocratic kinship networks faded as the power of the centralized national monarchy grew. It wasn't a simple or smooth transition by any means, but this was the long-term direction of change. This put the Protestant reformers in an ironic position, for they bitterly opposed the assertion of royal authority in church governance. It was Henry VIII who, in 1535, proclaimed himself supreme head of church and state. But for all their resistance to royal authority in the name of religious freedom, the reformers handed the king's propagandists a powerful metaphor. James I, who followed Elizabeth to the throne in 1603, claimed that as king he was the lawful father of his subjects and had as much natural right to rule over them as a father did over his children. Now, all these forces are in play during the 1590s, when Shakespeare writes A Midsummer Night's Dream, and so is one other. For almost 50 years, from 1557 to 1603, the king was a queen. And not just a queen, but an unmarried queen who used her virginity as a political strategy to retain power. This was a major stumbling block for the ideology of male supremacy and the sanctity of Protestant marriage. As you might expect, it led to a lot of backlash, a lot of male resentment. In 1599, the Earl of Essex actually tried to depose Elizabeth with an armed rebellion that fizzled in the streets of London. But while it never resulted in a successful armed rebellion, resentment of the Queen was real and widespread, reaching its high point during the decade of the 1590s when A Midsummer Night's Dream was performed. Next time, we'll take a closer look at the way Queen Elizabeth figures in the language, imagery, and action of the play. And as we explore this aspect of the text, we'll see that the metaphor of the king, or duke, as it happens in this play, as father, and of the nation as family, it's a double-edged sword. It cuts both ways, offering a critique both of the queen and of patriarchal rule. It's an example of the way social and political ideologies of all stripes use the family to think about the nation, and the nation to think about family. And it's an example of the way literary texts call out these metaphors, along with the ideologies they support.